Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the Ethnically Podcast. And today I'm joined with a really special guest and someone who's got a specialty in sustainability and ESG, and a topic we haven't really covered yet on the Ethnically Podcast. So I'm really excited to welcome Saima Rasool. So welcome, Saima. Just a bit of an introduction into who Saima is. So Saima is a strategy and sustainability specialist with experience across policymaking, energy regulation, and ESG risk strategy consulting. She's also a recognized young leader as a COP28 UK youth delegate. She was TED Countdown 2023 youth delegate as well, and was a speaker at Amphibia 2023. She was awarded the top 50 most influential Muslims in Europe in 2023 by Equality X. And she's seen as an emerging thought leader, having worked at KPMG and many other organizations. So welcome, Saima. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me on
It's amazing. It's
board.
a privilege to have you as a latest guest on Ethnically. And yeah, as my sort of first question, I know I've given you a bit of a brief introduction to yourself, but do you want to speak a little bit more about your background and your career today and who you are as a person?
Oh my God, so many things. Okay, yeah. So thank you so much. As you mentioned, I specialize in sustainability and strategy. I graduated in politics, philosophy, and economics, which was basically me trying to say I have no idea what I want to do in the future. So I'm just going to do like a degree, 3 different subjects and see where that goes. Super lucky that I ended up doing an internship for a shadow treasury minister in her parliamentary office. And that also led me to doing an internship at the treasury itself. And that was when I first learned about the government's net zero goals, all about climate change and how the world is burning. And I was like, yeah, oh my God, like I want to work on this. So was very lucky that I got through to the Ofgem graduate program. So Ofgem is the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, and it regulates the energy sector for Britain essentially. So did loads of rotations on that, and then graduated off as a manager in the Strategy and Decarbonisation Directorate. So spent 2 years at Ofgem in total when I sold myself, as they say, to a consultancy. So I went to KPMG and I was in the ESG strategy group. So I was helping companies on their decarbonisation journeys mainly. So that was companies across various sectors. It could have been a financial services firm to a supermarket, so on and so forth, and literally help them on things like setting the net zero targets, doing their sustainability reports, helping them with the sustainability report. And yeah, as you mentioned, alongside that, doing a whole bunch of other things. So the TED Countdown, what's it called? Anthropy is another big one. And I'm now co-chair of the Emerging Leaders Alliance. So super into getting youth voices out there, and published 2 pieces of thought leadership report, which I'm going to shamelessly plug. So that's Diversity for Net Zero and Net Zero Influencers. And currently I'm helping my friend build out her not-for-profit called 2 Billion Strong. And that's all about getting more Muslims in climate action. And we're hoping to release a report with that very soon as well, called the Muslim Climate Action Report. And it's all about how to get more Muslims involved in climate action.
You're doing so much, and it's really interesting to hear like your career trajectory, starting with the graduate scheme. And I think it's really what I found really interesting was you got that spark and that interest in sustainability throughout like your graduate scheme and as you progress in your career, and stayed with you ever since. I definitely will be asking some more questions on 2 Billion Strong because it does sound like a really fascinating non-profit. In terms of like in your early career and when it comes to sustainability, and that's something I really want to talk to you about today, what were elements or projects or things that you worked on that you saw or were able to make a really positive impact in the sustainability sector?
So I suppose with Ofgem, just the power it has in terms of influencing the energy market to do the right thing and make sure that we achieve net zero goals. Things like one of the things I did was work on Sizewell C, the nuclear power station. So I know nuclear can be pretty controversial, but it's at the end of the day a low carbon source of energy. So working on the financing model for that was super fascinating. I also did a bit of work on the consumer side. So I worked for something called the Supply and Licensing Review, and I won't go into it, but essentially it was protecting consumers in terms of making sure they had more rights, particularly when suppliers failed. So yeah, the whole got to see a whole breadth of things, like from the back of the energy side to generation, all the way to the retail side and forward facing. And I think one of the most interesting things of being at the regulator was seeing all the sort of challenges that comes with net zero. So for example, there was a team working on the levy for electric cars and trying to encourage more people to use electric cars. And then on the flip side, you've got the vulnerable consumers team who focus on, how do we make sure that we're not putting too much burden on consumers, particularly those in vulnerable circumstances, like a single mother who's, choosing between heat and eat. And it's like you're sitting there and you just see there's so many different realms because on one hand, frankly, encouraging middle class people and like giving them a bit of a break to go buy an electric vehicle. But then on the flip side, there's, like I said, someone in a very vulnerable situation, like a single mother, you're trying to balance the price of energy for that person. So there's loads of arguments. And I think that was like super fascinating to try and tackle and see how you can be as just as you
Yeah,
can.
I think
So yeah.
it's interesting you bring up sort of circumstances like a key disparity within. Obviously, as we're on the Ethnically podcast, it would be most relevant to talk about race as a disparity and ethnicity. Did you see
Yeah.
any of those sort of challenges when it came to people's issues with sustainability or like how they in with it?
Yeah. So I think yeah, no, super great you touched on that. So really frankly speaking, I think net zero in the sustainably world, I think it's changing a lot, especially in recent years. But I think particularly when I started, it was very much seen as a white middle class problem. And it was like, oh my God, you just think, oh, just everyone drive a Tesla and the world will stop burning. And you don't, at the time, I didn't realize the concept of the just transition and how sadly underrepresented groups or minorities are disproportionately more affected by climate change than other groups. And on that as well, particularly when I worked at the energy regulator, it wasn't necessarily the most diverse sector to work in energy. So oftentimes I was either like the only person of color on a team, sometimes I was the only woman on a team, sometimes I was the only woman of color, both as in like I was the only person of color on the team and the only woman on the team. So it was really interesting to work in a sector that frankly wasn't that diverse. But one thing I must say is just because everyone might look a certain way or they might not necessarily look like you doesn't mean that they're not going to help you in your career. It doesn't mean that they're not trying to be the sort of diverse and inclusive. And I think I was super lucky that, yes, okay, like for example, I think I had line managers that were all essentially fitting a certain stereotype, and there's very much cookie cutter civil servants of what you would expect. I always felt supported, and I think I was very lucky in that sense. I think particularly at the beginning, I grew up in an incredibly diverse area, and I was never really felt the other, or I never actually saw myself as a minority because I went to a school where everyone knew really speaking. So when I started the world of work, that's when I was like, "Oh my God, nobody looks like me." What? And it was like quite a culture shock. And then especially in certain parts, not just the energy regulators, but in the civil service as a whole, there was times where I was probably like, I'll be in a meeting room and I was probably the only person who didn't go to Oxbridge, for example. So there's like loads of differences. With that being said, I think you can definitely use it to your advantage in terms of just learning about others and also bringing things to their attention of, has it ever occurred that I'm the only non-Oxford person in this? Like, why do we think that is? And like having those thought-provoking conversations with team members. And I think that helps drag change and also feeding into things like recruitment and making sure that recruitment processes are equal.
First of all, when you talked about the just transition, like you said, when I was doing a bit of
Yeah.
research, I didn't realize how disproportionate the impacts are to ethnic communities, not just here, but across the world, really. So that was something that really stood
Yeah.
out to me. There are a lot of countries in sort of Asia and Africa that are bearing the brunt of climate change across the world. So that was definitely like, I can definitely see that as a big problem for society. I think as well, one thing
Yeah.
that definitely resonated with me is I have a very similar experience in terms of coming into the world work and being the only person of color in the workplace. Not necessarily in the
Yeah.
workplace, but in a team or part of an organization where it's majority white. And then you're used to living in an area, East London, for example, where it's very diverse. So that is quite a culture shock. I think the energy sector is doing quite a lot to tackle that. Is that something you would say?
Yeah, I think the last podcast I was on, actually, Modio Energy's one, I went into it on there of there's a lot going on in the energy world where they're recognizing, yeah, there's a problem. We do need a just transition. And not just the energy world, but I think loads of because of wider regulations as a whole, there's loads of regulations from the top that are coming in that are like, you need to report on your workforce targets, your things like making sure that your workforce is representative of the customers you represent or the countries you're in, so on and so forth. So I think a lot is happening. And I think also with, especially when I remember I was working during the George Floyd sort of protests and Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. And it was so interesting to see how that really shifted the narrative in the workplace. And race was no longer something that was just on the sidelines. It was something we had to speak about, and that it was encouraged to talk about how a wider world events affecting you. And I think seeing that change was so interesting, particularly because I'm on the Gen Z millennial cast. So yeah, so I definitely see the differences of there's people from different generations of how they approach things like race and speaking about race. I think the younger generation are a lot more open to have those thought provoking conversations, slash they might have different attitudes. So it's always interesting when you're like on the border to see like both sides and how that interacts. And I think that's just me being just super optimistic and just trying to be as positive as I can be. But I do think things are shifted in a better direction. And thankfully, things like regulation do help with that, where they do encourage companies to do the right thing, and the rise of ESG, making sure that your workforce is considered an asset and building on that as much as you can and attracting and retaining the best talent.
Nothing very much so on the topic of ethnically wanting to include diverse communities and be as inclusive as possible. I think it's really interesting that the energy sector, knowing that they have these disparities, are doing that work. And yeah, that's not just in the sector, but across many different industries. And something that I'm finding a lot, having spoken to a lot of people already on the podcast from different industries. I find it interesting when you mentioned the Gen Z perspective, because I'm noticing that as well in the workplace. A lot of these big complex societal issues and worldwide events really having a big say on how organizations are shifting their culture and their strategy.
Yeah.
I guess a lot of that comes from, and it's built into ESG. So my next question because I know ESG is it's an interesting, it's a term that a lot of people do know, but it's also quite complicated. And I guess there might be a few listeners that would want to know what it really actually means. So what does ESG know? What does ESG mean to you?
Yeah.
And what does it mean in general?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think ESG can sometimes be considered such a buzzword. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Ideally, it's all those how those three things fit together. So environmental focuses on making sure, let's just say if it's a business context, making sure that businesses are being as green and clean as possible. And then the social side of things is typically people focused, but also a lot wider than that, making sure that the communities they operate in are they're giving back in a social way. So the environmental examples I can give you is they setting a net zero target, saying that they're going to cut emissions and that any emissions they do have, they're going to offset them, for example. When it comes to a social example, it could be that let's just say it's a company that's building a brand new power station in a certain area. They're now going to make sure that the local community benefits from that. So there'll be jobs. They'll have things like upskilling people in the local community, training them, and making sure that they benefit. And then governance is super crucial. So it's making sure that what you do as a business in terms of decision making is fair, it's transparent, and there's accountability. So, first of all, very basic things like making sure there's no corruption. But in terms of how you can be a leader in that, is making sure that you bonuses of the people right at the top are linked to the ESG targets, for example. So it's making sure that leadership are doing the right thing to create a really positive culture.
That does make sense. So, because obviously I knew it from a personal point of view, but hearing that breakdown is actually really useful, particularly
Yeah,
governance, I think, because governance is such a broad term. And then hearing in terms of you have
yeah,
that accountability aspect and ensuring leadership are doing the right thing. And so if you have a for-profit business, that money is being reinvested in the right ways. So that does make a lot of sense. And I
exactly.
think honestly, that's a really good explanation of ESG. So thank you for that.
Did learn something after all that 2 years at KPMG.
Um, Speaking of, I think your time at KPMG actually is a very good transition, a just transition, should I say. You also were a UK youth delegate at COP28, and that's something I'd really love to hear more
Yeah.
about. What was the experience like?
Yeah.
What did you learn? What did you do? And yeah, what were things that you picked out that you could really share with the audience?
So COP28, or like COP in general, it stands for Conference of the Parties. So it's an annual United Nations gathering for governments, business leaders, so on and so forth. So they refer to as delegates. And companies go there, but also countries have negotiators, and they all negotiate terms and agreements to try and make the world a greener place. So some of the famous things that came out of COP are making sure there's a loss and damage fund. So a central source of money that countries having negative impacts of climate change can access, so on and so forth. What a youth delegate essentially looks like is as part of something called the Future Leaders Network. So you can Google them, and what they do is train up young people and give them something called a Blue Zone Pass. So each COP has two zones. There's a green zone, which is open to the public, and then a blue zone, which is the United Nations blue zones that are strictly for delegates only. And that's where decision making happens, different sessions happen, so on and so forth. And there's stalls and stands is the best way to do it. I don't know if you've been to like a uni careers fair, and like each, I don't know, employer has a stand. It's similar to that. So as a youth delegate, I was representing UK youth, and we were super lucky that government ministers, shadow ministers, MPs, policymakers, so on and so forth, really made time for us, including the UK negotiations team. And we had quite open working relationships where we tried our best to negotiate and influence what the youth perspective would be on certain things. It might be an element of the loss and damage fund that we would say that we really want to push for this because as youth, it would benefit us in X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. So yeah, loads of sort of relationship making, loads of meeting really cool people and being inspired and really trying to just put our point across as UK youth and making sure UK youth had a voice. Yeah, that was super brilliant. And in terms of how I got there, this is just to say it's a lesson for you never know what's around the corner. I literally got my Blue Zone Pass badge thing like 6 weeks before. Like I only found out 6 weeks before I was going to go that, oh my God, I'm going to COP. And I like for, I think week one, I got my Blue Zone badge at the airport before I flew out to Dubai because it's 2 different weeks. And with Future Leaders Network, I got, yeah, that whole week badge for the Blue Zone. But then the first week, it was through a couple of other organizations that I was in touch with. And then I only got my final confirmations like the week before, like, yeah, the day off, sorry. But yeah, with that, honestly, what I would say is just always have your eyes open, always network, find people that are going to COP and like really, really try your best to put yourself out there. And like I said, that opportunity opened up for me 6 weeks before COP, and I thought, let's do it because it's in Dubai, and I had friends in Dubai, and I just wanted to go to Dubai. So I was like, let's do it.
That's
So
brilliant
yeah.
because you actually answered my next question. But it was really amazing to hear like the sort of experiences that you had at COP28. And I think also to hear what you and the other youth delegates had, like that impact to actually speak to the big decision makers and influence them and tell them how you feel about climate change and yeah, impact their decisions. My question was going to be, but you answered it. But if you have any other thoughts to this, because we've got a generation of young people that are fully invested in dealing with the climate crisis and will not stop. If if they feel like a wrong decision is
Yeah.
made, they will challenge it. So what advice would you give to any young people that are looking to either get into working in climate change or how they can influence climate change policy or get in those sort of spaces, work in that industry? I know you said network and build connections and
Yeah.
see how you can broaden it from there. But what other advice would you give for those that are really passionate about climate change?
Yeah, sure. So there's a whole bunch of things you can do. I think social media, use it to your advantage. There's so many different sort of networks and groups you can join, and it can look like different things. It might be like going to demonstrations. It might be things, as I mentioned, the Futures Leaders Network that advertises and encourages you to go to COP, so on and so forth. So I think it's finding your niche or what you think would fit well. Another thing, if you're a young professional, but it's not just open for young professionals, it's literally open for anyone who's interested in sustainability, is something called the KPMG Leaders 2050 Network. So if you Google KPMG Leaders 2050, it should be the first here, and you can sign up to the mailing list and attend events. And there you get to meet so many like-minded people who are like typically young professionals that are interested in sustainability. So it's finding things like that. I can't remember off the top of my head other plugs, but as I mentioned, the Future Leaders Network as well. So first of all, just finding that community and where you think you sit. And off that, just like making as many climate friends as you can, and just like I mentioned, networking, and believe me, the opportunities will open up. But even with Anthropy, you have a friend who introduced you to a friend, who introduced you to a friend, and then before you know it, you're just like doing the most. So yeah, I think just be super open, super active. But then at the same time, I know that's more like an in-person thing. So in terms of online, I think definitely just see what there is out there and like use Google, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever it is to your advantage, and just volunteer your time. And I always believe if you volunteer your time, it will always come back to you. And I think I've definitely seen that. So that would be my thing to like everyone who's listening is just go, just volunteer your time and see where it
I
goes.
think because a lot of people feel like, with especially if they're thinking about the climate crisis, is they've got to invest their own time, but it's issues that they're really passionate about. So definitely volunteering is a great solution. I think
Yeah.
the Future Leaders Network sounds like a great opportunity. And you mentioned the KPMG 2050 and sort of network, or was that Leaders
Leaders.
2050? Right. So those are
Yeah.
all like things that people can, after hearing this, can automatically sign up to or connect with or join. So those are really tangible and tangible advice, but also great things and initiatives that are already existing, not just for young professionals, but professionals in general. So that's amazing. And I know we spoke earlier and you touched on throughout your answer, something that you're really passionate about is just transition. And I guess that's why thinking your role as head of strategy or brand strategy at 2 billion strong. Could you talk a bit more about 2 billion strong, its aim, its mission? And I know you already alluded to it earlier, but it's something that I'm
Yeah.
really interested in. I'm sure a lot of listeners would want to hear what the organization's aiming to do.
Yeah, so 2 Billion Strong was founded by a lovely human called Nazia, who actually founded something else called Sustainably Muslim. So it's a double plug here. So yeah, definitely Google both things. And in terms of 2 Billion Strong, the campaign video reached something like 60,000 impressions on Instagram. And it was based off the fact that, particularly for us, we're the Pakistani Bangladeshi diaspora. We're using faith as a driver for climate action. So in Islam, there's a lot about Muslims. It's our duty to be stewards of the earth. We follow the path of our Prophet, peace be upon him, and we call that like the sunnah of the Prophet. And the path of the Prophet teaches us to live very simple lives, to be as sustainable as we can. An example of that is that we're encouraged to be semi-vegetarian, so have as much meat that will be nutritionally beneficial for you, but then don't overindulge. And this is not just something that's present in necessarily Islam, but I think that concept also reaches out to other faiths, particularly Abrahamic faith. Yeah, people of the book, but also beyond that, in many faiths teach, how nature is a blessing and how this planet is given to us as a trust and we should try our best to look after it. So it's trying to use that power to influence, first of all, the 4 million Muslims in the UK alone to sort of spread awareness about climate action and encourage them to also increase Muslim representation, because I think the Muslim voice is often not represented and it's trying to make that as diverse as possible. But also, I don't want it to be that every time you think of Muslims, you think, oh my God, yeah, the ones who are in the UAE digging for oil. I want it to be that actually, you know what, it's their religious duty to look after this planet. And yeah, and 2 billion is in reference to the 2 billion Muslims on the planet. So we're trying our best, as I said, to harness faith and create that change. One of the more tangible things we're doing, so we do things like advocacy efforts, host events. We have quite a lot of posts on our Instagram as well. But one of the main things we're doing is, as I mentioned, releasing the first ever Muslim climate action report. And that's all about some, okay, wait, pause. So we conducted some research talking about, let me do my spiel again for that. So we conducted some research exploring the barriers to climate action for Muslims. So why is it that Muslims aren't engaging in climate action essentially? And of those barriers, we then are coupling it with some recommendations on what organizations, individuals and community groups, so this is for both Muslim and non-Muslims, can do to tackle those barriers. So an example can be the lack of representation of Muslims in the mainstream climate debate. So what can you as an organization do, whether you're secular or Muslim, etc., to encourage more Muslims in climate action? So yeah, the report will be launched later this year. Yeah, should be launching at the Blue Earth Summit later this year. So that's in the middle of October. So if you don't know what the Blue Earth Summit is, where have you been? Google it, go to it, and watch us launch for
Amazing. It's, yeah, that's, first of all, I think it's really amazing to have an organization like 2 Billion Strong be founded. I think that's a incredible mission, incredible purpose. I think, like you said, harnessing faith. And one thing I think is really, I always ensure, I think I'm a strong believer of, is regardless of your faith, there are, like you said, nature and um, preservation, and those concepts of looking after one another, regardless of who it is
Yeah.
or what it is, that exists in every religion. So I think it's really, I'm really glad you raised that point. I think as well, yeah, a very interesting, I think, assumption that a lot of people do make is when they do think about the Muslim community, they do think about, yeah, oil and the UAE and those countries, because and they think of Muslims in a negative way. And I think that's really important that the
Yeah.
organization's challenging that assumption and making a positive change around that. So it's incredible the work that the you and the founder, I didn't
Yeah.
catch 2 billion strong as well.
No, so Nazia Sultana, she's amazing. Go follow her and everything as well, by the way, and Sustainably Muslim. But yeah, well, just on that topic, actually, as I said, Muslims, you usually associate them being in the Middle East, but a large population and percentage of Muslims actually live in, for example, South Asia or the Southeast of Asia. And those are the ones who are facing some of the deepest repercussions of climate change. So things like the Pakistan floods, the Bangladesh floods, Lahore in Pakistan being one of the most polluted cities in the world. So high levels of air pollution, so on and so forth. The heat waves in India and Pakistan, they're really suffering from the repercussions that sort of the West has brought upon them by being some of the biggest polluters in the world. So it's ready to highlight those injustices and not just environmental negatives, but also things that happen more socially. For example, in Pakistan, there's been a direct increase in child brides as a result of the Pakistan floods, because sadly, families can no longer support their children and are sadly just giving away their daughters. And it's things like that, that when you're policing the planet, you don't sit there and think, this is now going to rob a young child of her life, so, because she's in very difficult and challenging circumstances. So it's highlighting issues like that as well. First-hand experience, I was in Kashmir like about a month ago. It was like 50 degrees at any given moment. And my little cousins weren't going to school because schools were closed because it was too hot for children to go to school. But now that's them missing weeks and weeks of education because of heat waves, because of climate change. And again, when it's a country that has not contributed the level of emissions that are needed to make devastating impacts.
Hearing that it doesn't just have an impact on day-to-day life, but your education, and hearing that has a preventing young children going to school is you wouldn't think that immediate impact of climate
Yeah.
change, but it's crazy that it is. And it just shows that the climate crisis is more than just natural disasters, heat waves, droughts, floods, for example. It's so much more. And I think that's, yeah. And like you said, it is having disproportionate impacts across the globe. I guess as well, it's very obvious from speaking to Saima that like a lot of your influence and advocacy comes from that D&I, diversity and inclusion context. And I think just one of the next questions I wanted to ask is, because as a leader in the space, how does diversity and inclusion make up your work, and how does it affect you as a leader and how you want to enact that change in the world?
Yeah. Oh my God. Leader is like such a big title. I don't think I could take that, but I'll definitely be an advocate. And I think for me, it is really frankly because I think you can relate as well of just growing up where I didn't feel like I was a minority and then being placed into situations or circumstances where I felt like I was a minority and that it wasn't necessarily the best thing, or just to like raise awareness essentially of the benefit. I think when it comes to DNI, particularly for climate change, people need to realize that climate change is a huge sort of massive challenge. It's a once in a generation challenge, which means it needs a whole new way of thinking. It needs the status quo to be challenged. It needs new ideas. It needs innovation. And the only way we're going to get there is if we have different, like that diverse background of thinking, diverse thoughts, different people going against the grain and being really innovative so that we can tackle that challenge of climate change, which is why I'm all about D&I and making sure we're doing things the most efficient way that we can. And I suppose also on the level of like corporate, just making sure that climate change sort of world is not just influenced by people who look a certain way or from a certain background, and that is actually open for everyone and it's not just seen as elite.
Yeah, with diversity, I think it's interesting you raise like that diversity of thought as well, and backgrounds, and not just privilege, but having different forms of education. And you mentioned that you were in a room of everyone else went going to Oxbridge, and that's not necessarily a diversity of thought of education that you need to solve challenges like the climate crisis. So that's definitely something I've been pushing through for, and reiterating that point throughout many of the other podcasts, whether it's talking about sustainability or youth engagement or politics or whatever the sort of industry is. It's definitely that common thread that sort of runs through dealing with these big problems. But no, that's amazing. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today's ethnically. Make sure to check out 2 Billion Strong. I'm sure we'll link socials and everything in the podcast description. But yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Saima, and thank you once again.